Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are back in War Thunder and we're doing a comment response. Now, if you have a question or a query and you want it answered in a video like this, just leave a comment on a video. I'll find it and I'll record it. The same goes for replays as well. All of the replays sent in are recorded in a folder. It just takes a while for me to get to them. But anyway, this question comes in through Archaon, I'm guessing I'm saying that right, and it says, what is your view on spawn camping? So spawn camping is one of those issues which does occur in War Thunder, but in my experience is not that much of a huge issue. When it does happen in games, it is incredibly annoying, especially after the first spawn you die and you have a second spawn and you get killed straight out of the gate after 5 minutes. But I do think it is an issue which is one of those where you remember the games where it happens, but kind of forget the other games, kind of like a negative feedback loop. So what happens a lot in general games, not just War Thunder and others, but people tend, or maybe in just life in general, people tend to remember the bad parts and kind of forget about the good parts. It seems to be something with the human psyche and how it works. And I think spawn camping is kind of in that area, where people bring it up quite a lot because obviously it creates a very negative experience for them, but I think it is overpronounced on how often it happens. Even though, with that said, it is obvious that it does happen, and therefore we should talk about it. So for me personally, I don't put the blame on a player for exploiting game mechanics. I blame the game itself. There have been a lot of games, especially MOBAs in the last few years, where you have a champion or you have a skill which can be abused to its fullest. And maybe the devs miss it, maybe it has been reported but it takes them a while to fix it. But I don't blame the individual player for exploiting something which should be fixed in the game by the developers. I think that's kind of the wrong way around. What you should do is talk to the developers and try and get them to fix it. It's pretty much how I feel about the CAS issue as well. So let's go from that point of view. We'll go from it how it can be exploitative in the game, and how to fix those exploits as we go along, or at least offer some solutions. I could just sit here for 20 minutes smashing on about spawn camping and how it's annoying, but that's not very productive, so solutions it is. So in my head, there are two stages, or two types of spawn camping. The first one is where you start the battle. Let's say you are average Joe number 1. You decide to go straight to the barrier of the map and decide to go around the whole map, sit either behind the enemy spawn or to the near it or to the side of it, waiting for people to spawn in their second vehicles and take them out. The second type of spawn camping is when a team wins the initial major engagement, which generally takes part in the first 5 minutes of a battle, and is able to push through your lines which have been broken and sit in front of the enemy spawn and waiting for them to come out. So the second one happens quite a lot when an enemy team has just crushed a central point, or the map is designed in such a way where if you crush that central point, they can just push through and absolutely obliterate you. An example of a map which is like this is Eastern Europe. A lot of people fight over that central point, and generally whoever wins that central point fight will push through to the enemy base and just sit outside of it, wait for people to spawn, and batter them into hell and back. This is an unfortunate thing, but it isn't really spawn camping in my opinion. If we're talking about true spawn camping, we are talking about the people who at the start of the match decide that it is their duty to go around the whole match, missing the fight, and just going to sit near the enemy spawn waiting for people to come out so they can get kills and pad their KD instead of actually contributing to the battle. So because of this, we're going to talk mainly about the first set of guys and gals who do it, and then we're going to move on to also the second set. So one of the proposed solutions to this problem, and many problems which may occur in War Thunder, is the idea of a gentleman's agreement, being able to try and reason with the whole of the player base in a way that you can basically say to them, look, let's all agree not to do this, and then the problem will go away. That's never worked ever. The only place I can think of it working is in a professional scene in the last major in CSGO. One of the, or some of the teams found that there is a certain jump that you can use where you can see over certain objects, but the enemy cannot see you jumping. So therefore you can see them, but they can't see you. And you're obviously not making a lot of noise at the same time because it's this weird kind of crouch jump. Now, there was a gentleman's agreement in that professional major, but that's between very high-level players and obviously between a very small part of the player base. Obviously, if you went to ranked game mode around that time, you would find thousands upon thousands of people using the same bug, or whatever you want to call it, to be able to exploit it. So even if, let's say, in the English-speaking part of the War Thunder community, you were able to somehow get everyone to sign a waiver saying, I will not camp your spawn, that's still not even half of the player base, because Eastern Europe and Russia and places like that exist. So even having this idea of a gentleman's agreement, even if you got the whole of American players and English players to sign, you would still be kind of screwed because people would still do it. There is also no reason for people to agree to that. It's basically taking away parts of the game which maybe they're good at, or maybe they enjoy. So therefore I just don't see it as a solution. It's a solution that gets bandied around for a lot of things. It also gets bandied around for AA on airfields. The idea that if the person is just a gentleman, therefore they won't go around the airfield constantly and wait for you to get shot by the AA. But that happens a lot as well. So I don't think it's even worth talking about. So let's talk about the solutions for the first type, which is the type where people just go around the side of the map and then spawn camp you. So first of all, one of the easy things to bring up for this is better map design. There is actually a few maps which deal with this issue, but don't really deal with both of the issues at the same time. So the 38th parallel is a wonderful example of a map which deals with the first issue. It's pretty much impossible to flank around on the 38th parallel, because if you do, you basically run into a massive river, or you have to scale a mountain. So therefore you can't really get behind the enemy spawn. Now in my map analysis I did show you how you can actually get behind the enemy spawn in the rocks, but generally I don't see people doing that, maybe because it takes a bit too much time. But by dealing with this first issue, it emphasizes the second issue, which is if a team is able to push through and they're able to camp your spawn in a more legitimate way. The way the 38th parallel deals with the first issue is to create these paths coming out of each spawn, so it's pretty much impossible to push up those paths at any given time because generally there are tanks coming out of those paths. The only way you can really do it is if you have something like a 75 jumbo, or if you just get incredibly lucky. It isn't something that you can legitimately aim for. And the whole flanking around notion, well, on the right hand side, or whatever side that you're looking at, the dam side, you can't flank around because the domination point is there. And on the left side, well, I suppose there is a shallow bit of the river that you can use to flank around, but good luck getting up the hill to get behind the spawn. You would have to go up the side of the mountain, which you can do, but it's just incredibly hard, and the majority of tanks in the game are not able to do it. What I mean by that it emphasizes the second issue, though, is because you have set up a map which deals with the first issue, you've created these narrow areas where tanks have to come from the spawns through. There are 3 areas from each spawn: the left road, the center road, and the right road. In order to get out of either spawn, you have to go down one of these roads, otherwise you cannot get out of your spawn. It's as simple as that. You can try and go down the rice fields, which don't have a lot of rice in them, but you'll get shot immediately because you're out in the open. So if, let's say, one team wins the initial major engagement and pushes up, on the 38th parallel, you need pretty much just 2 tanks to be able to cover the whole map. One looking at the left side, another one looking at the right side, and they're both checking the center while they're sat there. So because of that, you can't get out of your spawn if you have just 2 or 3 coordinated players working together. So therefore it emphasizes the second issue. Another one, which is the opposite, is the Ardennes. It actually deals with the second issue, but emphasizes the first issue. So, the second issue is pretty much dealt with if you have a large open space from or in front of the spawn which has some cover, whether it be houses, whether it be bushes, whether it be just rolling hills. And the Ardennes has all 3 of these. It has a couple of houses, it has some bushes and trees, and it also has some rolling hills. So the second issue is pretty much solved by that, because it's quite hard to get a shot onto the spawn unless you're right next to it, which at that point you've pretty much won the battle anyway. So that second issue is sorted. But because you have this open area, because you have the bushes, the rolling hills, the houses, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to actually move into the enemy spawn and be able to sit around the back of it and also to the side of it watching for tanks to come out, because you can use the enemy's cover against them. So you see the issue here. We have maps which either solve one issue and make the other one a lot easier to do, or we have a map which does the opposite. There isn't a map in the game which solves both of these issues at once. But in my head, it's much better to get a map which deals with the first issue instead of dealing with the second issue. Because the second issue itself is more down to a core issue of the gameplay which has to be solved, and there's a few ways of solving it which we'll get into. But the core issue with the gameplay itself is the emphasis on the initial engagement and how much it affects the battle. Maps like Berlin, maps like Eastern Europe, maps like Poland, all fall victim to these ideas, even the Ardennes. The initial engagement in the first 5 minutes of a battle is so crucial for a team to win. What generally happens is that after they win that, they just push through, and that's all they have to do. And that's what creates the second issue for the spawn camping, where they get to sit outside of your base. So therefore, instead of having to deal with that second issue, we have to go a step backwards and deal with that initial engagement. And the only way to really deal with the trying to take less emphasis on that initial engagement is to create a better spawning system. Now this is something that Mags talked about in one of his videos. He was hypothesizing how to get rid of the issues of spawning in realistic battles. Because at that time, and at this time as well, generally what happens is, after the initial engagement is fought, people are coming to the front lines again, but they're coming in drips and drabs, so they get picked off one by one. So he theorized, would it be better to have a strict 3 spawn limit, but instead of just being able to spawn whenever you want, you have kind of waves of allies which come in. So therefore, instead of just having 1 or 2 tanks moving onto the front line, you have a whole team moving onto the front line, or maybe half a team moving onto the front line and the other half in aircraft. This would set up the game so it would actually be fighting in stages, and it would also get rid of the burden of that initial engagement. So technically, this should deal with the second stage, because what would happen is a bunch of tanks would spawn in at the same time. The enemy team would maybe have a few tanks which survived the initial battle if they won it, and therefore all of those tanks which just spawned in could deal with the enemy tanks which have pushed forward. So therefore that is a solution to the issue. Now I'm sure there are a few issues that I'm not thinking of with that solution, but it solves it. It solves the second issue, even though it may bring around other issues. Does it solve the first issue though, of people just going around the edge of the map and pushing into or sitting near or behind your spawn? I don't think it does. Because what will happen is, once you move out with the large convoy of tanks, the enemy team will just wait and then pop out once the last tanks are moving out and shoot you in the arse. Now, this won't always happen, and maybe if you check 350 degrees before you move out, before you start moving, then you'll be able to deal with the first stage. But I don't think that will be possible, because people will work out what timings are the waves and just wait until those times get in a position and then pop out. So I don't think that solves it. Another solution, which may solve the first issue, is just having AI tanks which sit around the spawn. It's a pretty simple solution. Basically you have maybe some medium tanks or some heavy tanks. They're invulnerable, of course, but they won't be as powerful as players, because generally their guns aren't as good as the players. But what happens is, if you are found behind, basically you could set it up so there's a cone behind your base, and if you, as an enemy, ever enter that cone, these AI tanks will target you and go after you, taking you on and taking you out, preventing you from sitting behind the cap and waiting for people to spawn in. At the same time, you could set it up so there's a radius in front of them of, let's say, something like 300 meters, but once again, the number is irrelevant. It can get changed, or, depending on what's going on in the game and what distance is the best. And if you encroach on that 300 meters, if you're near the spawn, then once again the AI tanks will open up on you. Maybe that is a solution. Some invulnerable AI tanks around the spawn which would deal with spawn campers which moved around the edge of the map in the first 2 minutes and are now in your spawn. That could work. Now, it all depends on how good the AI is in War Thunder, and as we know from many experiences, well, it's not always great, is it? Sometimes it definitely has some issues. But I think that could be something that works. Another solution, mainly for the second stage, because it doesn't really address the first stage's issues, is the idea of just having more exits from spawns, so they can't be easily covered. It's kind of interesting looking at the new map that was just released. Well, it's not released, having a look at the German map, which is between East Germany and West Germany. I'll just look up the name now, so I can get it for you. The Fulda Gap map. Because if I'm right about where the spawns are, we have a situation which is so open that the second issue and the first issue are both going to be problems. Because at the start of the map, people are just going to go around the edge of it and sit behind your spawn, and if that team also wins the initial engagement, they're just going to sit on a hill and watch as you guys try and move out of your spawn. So maybe that would be a test bed to try and work out how to deal with the spawn camping issue from a gameplay point of view. Because that's kind of going too far one way. The spawns are so open, there are technically infinite exits, but because you are on just a plane by yourself, it's going to be very easy to see tanks that move in and move around. It doesn't really matter if you spawn on that outpost or in the open field on either side of the battle. Both of those issues are going to be a problem. Oh dear. Every time I think about that, it's it's just going to be bad, especially at tier 5 with leopards, because it seems to be the major culprit that I've run into recently doing this is leopards. But yeah, so more exits from spawns, as long as it's not infinite or a massive open space where the enemy can sit, does cause the second type of spawn camping to disappear. But for me personally, I think it's right to focus on the first type of spawn camping, which is trying to get people in the battle instead of giving them an incentive to run around the side of it and shoot people as they come out of their spawn. Generally, they'll be fighting weaker tanks at the same time, and also they'll have to deal with AA, not main battle tanks. So you've got to make it that objectives are worth more. You've got to give people more of an incentive to win the battle instead of pad their KDs. And you've also got to understand that there is always going to be people out there who decide that padding their KDs means something in an objective-based game, which is more predominantly based on wins when it comes to research than just padding your stats, especially in tanks. So therefore it's not a problem which is ever going to go away. If you have a multi-spawn system in any multiplayer game, this spawn camping is always going to be something that's going to happen. It just is. So therefore you have to deal with it, and you have to come up with creative solutions, mainly around map design, to be able to try and solve it. So if you have any solutions, let's hear them. I'd like to read them, because obviously the ones I've covered are kind of interesting, but I don't think they'll change the game too much. Maybe the game needs some kind of radical change. So yeah, give me a read. Let's see. Let's see with some solutions that you come up with. But anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.